So you'll recall that last time we talked about what the heck is anthropology? What have I gotten myself into with this course? And we decided that anthropology is the study of humanity. But since there are several fields that study humanity, we need to be more specific than that. Specifically, it's a holistic study. That means we're looking at all the different aspects of society across all time and all cultures, okay? And some of our big picture questions that guide all of anthropology: what do we have in common as human beings and why? How are we different and why? And how did things come to be the way they are? Now, a reasonable question to ask yourself, though, is, well, that's great. That sounds awesome. I love it. I want to major in it. But how exactly do you go about studying all of humanity across all space and time? What does that actually look like? So that's the goal for today. We're going to talk about the four fields of anthropology. Now, if you, so I've got here a subtitle: if you don't use test tubes and wear lab coats, is it even science? So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how anthropology does its research, what it looks like as a social science. So you may or may not have ever read the book Foundation by Isaac Asimov. I'm a sci-fi geek, so I have. In it, Harry Seldon comes up with what he calls psychohistory, which is the ability to minutely predict the future actions of humans. And he explains it as, individual humans being unpredictable, but ultimately as social groups, when they become large aggregates, they fall into predictable trends, and he's able to develop sort of a way of predicting that, which then allows him to set certain things in motion. I won't say more because I understand it's a TV series now, so I don't want to be the jerk that's giving a bunch of spoilers. But anyways, that was the idea in the popular sci-fi series Foundation, which is now a TV show. You may also be familiar with John Locke. No, not this guy. Not John Locke from the TV show Lost, but the guy he gets his name from, John Locke, the Enlightenment philosopher, who believed that as the Renaissance, as Enlightenment scholars, such as Isaac Newton, were coming to sort of ascertain scientific laws as they saw it, universal laws about how nature and the physical world operated. Scholars like John Locke felt that they could do more or less the same with human society, that they could develop the laws upon which human societies develop and are built, the sort of predictable ways in which human beings have behaved, do behave, and will behave. So that's sort of been a dream, I might say a pipe dream, of humanity for some time now. The idea that we could sort of develop some kind of scholarly field where we'd be able to predict what people do. And indeed, Facebook and Instagram's ability to track us and target ads towards us notwithstanding, generally speaking, the ability to perfectly capture and predict human society is not something we're able to do, certainly not in anthropology. Or to put it a little bit differently, we can't put humanity in a test tube. We can't sort of have all of humanity, put it into a laboratory, and then do sort of precise scientific experiments, and then try to predict what will happen. Why can't we put humanity in a test tube? First of all, it's unethical. People don't like being smushed into test tubes. It's uncomfortable. Second of all, it's impractical. You could never fit all 8 billion human beings into one test tube, and test tubes are expensive, so it would get really expensive really fast. No, that's just me trying to be funny. What I actually mean by that is, why is anthropology by its nature sort of a field study, something where you go out and do research out there, right, out in communities, or out excavating things in the ground or things like that? And the reason is because what we're trying to understand does not lend itself well to carefully controlled experiments in a laboratory. That is great for discovering certain sorts of things. The scientific method, well, specifically the type of scientific method that uses experiments, is really, really great for certain kinds of things, such as chemistry and physics and a number of other kinds of fields. It's difficult to do with culture, right? You can't sort of like put two villages into a lab or something and then say, okay, well, one of you is going to develop agriculture and one of you isn't. We'll have our control and our treatment, and then we're going to see how political inequality and patriarchy develop or don't develop, right? That is not something you could do with a human being, nor is it something that you should do with a bunch of human beings. We're not, or to put that a little differently, we're not trying to understand objects here. We're not trying to understand chemicals here. We're trying to understand a complex shared human world that we all share together, our fellow complicated, beautiful, wonderful human beings, and who are by their very nature, even at the individual level, unpredictable, and also, sorry, Isaac Asimov, also very complex and hard to predict at the societal level. Some things we can develop sort of, predictability for. For example, we can generally predict that if a society developed agriculture historically, then they will also develop a writing system and political bureaucracy that will often lead to empires of some sort or monarchies of some sort. However, although we can come up with that, a lot of that stuff is sort of retroactive, right? And also, it doesn't always work that way. And also, it's one of those things that we really have to understand it in context because it can look so different from place to place to place. But all I'm trying to get at is that anthropology is not the kind of field where we can do it sort of. There are parts that we might do in a lab, right? We might take things back to a lab and do genetic analysis or something, but ultimately it's a science that depends a lot on sort of going out and interacting with, right, the humans that are out humaning. So again, then, how do we do it? How do you study humanity in this sort of cross all time, cross all societies way? How do you do that thing you do? I'm not talking, of course, about the popular 90s movie with Tom Hanks. I'm talking about how do we do things like learn about society 20,000 years ago so that we can talk about the ways things changed, the 3 changes that changed everything, as I dramatically put it on the syllabus. How is it that we learn about how food is done all across all different societies, or how social control is done, and how do we answer a question like, do people need laws and governments to thrive? These are complex, big picture questions that apply across billions of people, across tens of thousands of years, so how is it that we actually get any sort of handle on that? And the answer again is research, but very specific kinds of research. And some of our research looks very different from each other. So for example, this is an archaeological excavation site where people are spending weeks, probably months, maybe even years, slowly, painstakingly brushing away, digging away dirt. Usually they'll start with some test pits, some deep burrows into the ground to see if you hit any actual artifacts or if it's all just soil. And then slowly going deeper into the ground once you've found something, and recording what you're doing every single step of the way, drawing sketches of it, taking pictures of it, cataloging and bagging every single artifact you get into. That's very different than somebody doing field observations of the behavior of chimpanzees, which in turn is very different from somebody doing what I spend a lot of my time as a researcher doing, ethnographic fieldwork, where you go, hang out in a community, and record what people think about a certain subject that you're interested in. And that in turn is a little bit different from sitting with, let's say, the last fluent speaker of a dialect, or one of the last fluent speakers of a specific dialect of an endangered language, as we see here with Alan Boris and Peter Kalafonsky, and recording, right, piece by piece, how different verbs get conjugated in a language so that you can write up a dictionary or a grammar book. And that in turn is a little bit different than trying to reconstruct the human family tree, or rather I should say the hominin family tree, by digging skeletons of, let's say, Australopithecus out of the ground and then comparing it to other variants of Australopithecus. All of these different things look really, really different from each other. And there's obviously overlap here, right? You're doing something in the ground, you're talking to people. But at the end of the day, there's as much different as there is the same. Which brings up the point that anthropology is a diverse field. We're humans trying to understand how humans human, but we have to kind of separate our labor into a few different fields. And I want to talk about what those are and why they each exist, and then we'll kind of wrap it back around to the end about where this is all leading. So we'll be talking today about the 4 fields of anthropology: cultural anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and physical anthropology. 4 different approaches to studying how humans human, to try to really better understand our fellow human beings and how it is that our lives correspond to each other and differ from each other in interesting ways. So to be really sort of blunt and simplistic, not blunt, so these fields to a great degree work together, right? And they're taught together. If you were to go get like a PhD in anthropology and you're like, yes, please sign me up, you would take classes in all of these. And indeed, I took classes in all of these. However, individual people are going to kind of specialize in one or the other, usually at most two. Sometimes people will do two of these at a time, usually just one. Definitely there's overlap, but most people are kind of specialized in one area or the other, as you might expect, just like if you took a huge field like engineering, right? That's more than one thing. So even a more narrow field like anthropology, there's still multiple parts of it, and you kind of specialize. For example, your professor, Adam Dunstan, I am a cultural anthropologist first and foremost. I study people's cultures. Specifically, I study people's cultural views about the environment, cultural views about sacred space and religion, and things of this nature. I am also a bit of a linguistic anthropologist. I study I do a lot of work on how people use language to talk about these types of things. And I occasionally dabble in archaeology, particularly when it comes to making sure that sites meaningful to indigenous people are well protected, but primarily a cultural anthropologist with some linguistic anthropology leanings as well. Most of us specialize in one way or another. So cultural anthropology, though, and the other three fields, we all kind of focus on some different aspect of this bigger question of what it means to be a human being. They each get at a different dimension of that using a different method. Okay, so cultural anthropology studies our cultural and social lives. As human beings, we are social animals, fundamentally. That is what we are. And anthropology studies that, particularly modern day cultures. But what about the ones in the past? That's an important piece of the puzzle too, but you can't, go back and interview somebody in ancient Sumer. So what do? Well, you have archaeology. Archaeology studies our past cultural and social lives, what humans were up to way back when. Or sometimes not so way back when, but way back when long enough that perhaps the person's no longer around to talk to us about it. Physical anthropology then studies our physical lives. I sometimes like to think of it, although it's a bit simplistic, as our hardware and our software, to use a computer metaphor. Cultural anthropologists are very interested in our software, right, on the stuff that sort of gets downloaded into human beings and the kind of programs that we run, right, the kind of stuff that we pick up in our groups. Physical anthropology is very interested in the hardware, right? What is a human body? What is a human brain? How did these things come to be? Linguistic anthropology, in turn, studies our lives in and through language. Now, observant people are saying, wait a second, you cultural anthropologists, you big meanies, you got to go twice, right? Linguistic anthropology sounds a lot like cultural anthropology. Isn't language part of culture? And you would be absolutely fundamentally correct. However, language is so incredibly complex, and the techniques to study it are so specialized and unique that from a practical perspective, we treat these as two different fields, even though people do definitely blend the two, self included. My point with all of this, though, is each of these, in their own way, is essential to anthropology, telling a story about what makes humans the same, what we share in common, what unites us, as well as what makes us different and diverse and interesting in different times and places.